Yeah, thank you very much, Dave. This is kind of interesting. I was trying to come up with a novel way of presenting a, a few pieces of knowledge that are connected, but is intended primarily to provide some insight that you don't often get from looking at other aspects of the literature and things like that. So the title was Living Off the Land and Caribou's Relationship to the Land. And as you can see, I've called this episode 4, because what we're doing here, just like the Star Wars series, we're going to cut through a few interconnected themes here, but there could be prequels. There's aspects we're not going to be able to get into, and there could be sequels of other parts of the story. For instance, fire ecology piece I hope to cover in September's Wabakimi Rendezvous.
And thank you for the plug.
Okay. So the focus will be on the landscape and the all-important use of space. And I think that's, if there's something that defines caribou, is their use of space. And Anne Gunn was a real well-respected scientist working on caribou in the very far north. And she gave a quote one day that was really thought-provoking for me, and that was that the most important resource in caribou habitat is space in which to make their decisions. So in tonight's story, we're going to start with a little bit of basic biology, and then we're going to talk about an examination of how they use space and explore some of the characteristics of a kind of a caribou-friendly landscape, and then look at some of the special relationships between caribou and lichen. Okay, so that's roughly what we're going to cover off here. And some of it will go fairly quick, and others require a little bit more explanation. So caribou, the animal, right? It's smaller than an elk or a moose. It's bigger than a deer. Quite distinctive in general appearance. You've got that ventral mane, and you got the white neck, the little stubby tail, white socks, and bull caribou, 118 to 205 kilograms or so. Females have antlers. Caribou are one of the oldest members of the deer family. They are the oldest member of the deer family, and the females do have antlers. They're typically more spike-like, although they get larger in the far north. 80 to 100 kilograms is about normal for them. Their feet are extremely well adapted to the types of terrain they live in. They've got very large hoofs proportional to the animal compared to the other ungulates. They're crescent shaped, which give them a distinct footprint. They've got extremely sharp edges, and they're excellent paddles for swimming, and they're excellent for cratering through snow looking for lichens. Now, because of that footprint, you always know when you've encountered caribou footprints. It gives them super traction on ice and snow. And you've got that distinct crescent-shaped footprint that separates it nicely from a moose footprint. So when you're paddling in Wabakimi and you take a look at those sandy beach areas, and there's a good chance you might find a footprint. Although the footprint is distinctive enough, it also shows up in some of the feather moss mat areas near your campsites, and that's pretty distinctive. As I said earlier, and this is a really important part of the story later on, caribou are excellent swimmers, and you won't be the first one who will see a caribou swimming across the lake far in the distance and get an initial impression that it looks like a canoe, where the head's out of the water and the tail's out of the water, and it's kind of that low profile, but basically the whole back is out of the water. It's got a heavily furred nose, which is one of its adaptations to living in the very cold climate. And just a secret, because Vern brought it up early on in our little preamble chat before people were signing on there about special adaptations. They actually have nasal structures in their nose that helps recover water in the wintertime, because it's such a low humidity environment and those very cold temperatures. And They're not the same as, but it performs the same function as camels in the desert with the recovery of water. So you don't see those big clouds of exhaust breath when caribou are standing around that you see with other critters in the cold. So the calves are born in mid-May or so. It varies a little bit as you go from south to north. But the most important part of thinking about caribou and their use of the land is how it ties into the story of survival of cows with their calves. So the fundamental building block for a population persistence is successfully bringing a calf into the breeding population, right? So they don't breed. The young ones don't come into the breeding population until about 2.5 years of age. And they have to do that often enough with cows and calves. They have to do it often enough to replace the mortality that occurs, because otherwise the population is going down. And we're going to talk about that from several different angles tonight, but a lot of the caribou story relates about how an animal that is fairly vulnerable is able to survive in the landscape. And part of that is through the use of space. I wanted to go on for a minute here and just tell a little bit of a story about a couple of strategies that caribou use for in terms of how they use space. This is a 1980s map that came from a policy document at one point. We didn't call them ecotypes at the time this was mapped. This map was produced. But you see on the map there, they refer to something called a forest tundra caribou and a forest dwelling caribou. The term ecotype was attached quite a bit later. They're all the same species. In fact, they're all the same subspecies. But the forest tundra ecotype is migratory, and the forest dwelling typically is not. And the two different survival strategies that are being shown here is caribou that space apart. And that's what the forest dwelling ecotype does. Around calving season, a pregnant cow will go and find places where it will isolate, that it considers itself relatively free of predators, where it feels it's got a good chance of allowing its calf to survive. The migratory caribou, the forest tundra caribou, use a strategy of space apart. They typically exist in much larger herds, and their strategy is they'll spend an area in the time in the winter, sometimes in fairly large herds, and in the spring they will migrate en masse to areas where they overpower, right? They move from one area, they move to another, where they actually have calving grounds per se, but they're still woodland caribou. The new names that have been attached to these are Eastern Migratory Caribou for Ontario's migratory animals, and Boreal Caribou is the term that's being used from a science perspective and from a sort of a population dynamics perspective. And the ultimate rationale for these two strategies, it's a response to the land and to the climate. So if we look at these two different strategies at play here with this map of about 140 collared caribou here, the caribou that space away, they migrate. You can see some fairly interesting circular patterns here, but typically home ranges of those animals, mean home range of the animals that are on this map was about 60,000 square kilometers, right? So there's a use of space. Home range for the forest dwelling caribou, somewhere around 3,000 square kilometers. So quite an order of magnitude difference there. So caribou that space apart need to distribute themselves across the landscape in suitable landscape patches still averaging more than 3,000 kilometers in size. And the more fire that's on the landscape and the more logging disturbance on the landscape, the more patchy that distribution becomes. The basis for the movement patterns is often the caribou annual movements between areas that they spend seeking resources in the wintertime versus where cows tend to go in the spring to have their calves. So all the animals you see down here that are collared are females. So this would be typical female behavior, and male caribou tend to travel a little bit more. So I just want to deal with the migratory caribou just for a couple more minutes, and I'm just going to leave them entirely because they're not the ones we would find around Wabakimi. So when I talk about herds, these are similar to the types of herds we see further north with the barren ground caribou. They're all ages and all sexes. There's calves in there. This is actually July summer photos of them moving. You see that there's all ages and sexes represented in the groups. A fairly recent discovery, just in the summers of 2009 to 2011, we also encountered and discovered some very large inland aggregations of caribou, of migratory caribou in July. And this is a photograph of part of a herd of around 8,000 migratory woodland caribou in Ontario between the Fawn and the Severn rivers. And just for a matter of perspective here, that little highlighted band represents 95 animals, okay? So that's pretty impressive. And some people see this and say, wow, right? Why are we worried about caribou everywhere else? Well, I want to tell a little bit of story about space again and climate and adaptations to the land. So the actual dividing line between the migratory and forest-dwelling behaviors, the Boreal caribou behaviors, appears, according to Tom Bergerud, who was quite a well-known caribou scientist. He determined, based upon data he looked at all over particularly eastern North America and a little bit in the West, that the boundary between the sedentary behavior or the forest dwelling behavior and the migratory behavior appears to occur roughly at the location where open water occurs around calving season. So when water, which is a really important part of the caribou landscape, is unfrozen and thawed in open water during the calving season, the sedentary behavior usually occurs. And when the water is still frozen at that time of year, at the time of calving, migratory behavior tends to be adopted. And which is a real interesting perspective, one, on the use of space, but probably the most important thing is it interprets and begins to represent water as a habitat. And there's not too many species for which we would say that is true for ungulates. Having adaptation strategies to help with survival is really important because caribou as a population are remarkably vulnerable. They're late reproducing, like 2.5 years before they enter the population. Moose, elk, and deer all enter the breeding population before that. There's a low number of young, almost never twins. Moose and deer, twins or triplets, that's not uncommon at all. But typically one young, they're smaller than moose. When they encounter a predator, they're more vulnerable in that regard. They have behaviors to help deal with that. And they have habitat selection to help deal with that, but they are vulnerable. But the bottom line is very small reductions in recruitment or very small increases in adult mortality can have a large impact on whether the population is increasing or decreasing. And I think most of you know that typically caribou and boreal caribou in general are in trouble. So just a couple of kind of word slides here, just to try to talk about what are the attributes of a caribou-friendly landscape. Well, if you go and look at areas right across Canada, they would fit this kind of a description. A caribou landscape is dominated by larger tracts of older conifer forest, typically not young forest. Wetlands and water bodies that provide refuge are a very important component. This is a major predator avoidance strategy for them. But at the same time, they have to have adequate access to essential resources for growth and reproduction. So this is the first time we'll mention that security tends to come first, food tends to come later. And since the boreal forest is dynamic, and we have forest fires, and we have other things happening in the boreal forest, you have to have a continuous supply of these things. The biological basis for that caribou-friendly landscape is that typically caribou populations are thought to be limited by predation. Okay? Habitat selection and behavior is the primary mechanism by which they try to avoid predators. Caribou have adapted to a forest landscape pattern where they select based on security first and forage second. But this would be a very typical caribou landscape right here, where some of those features are presented and provided by the topography and the superficial geology of the landscape. And they play a major role in creating a landscape in which caribou can live. They have water, they support conifer forests, and they're typically nutrient poor and low productivity. Right? That's a general characteristic of caribou landscapes. I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes here on this slide. And it's that concept of refuge. I used the term refuge earlier. But the concept of refuge is a sort of an abstract property of a landscape. And it addresses that concept of security. And rather than describe specifically what refuge is, I want to talk a little bit about what makes it good refuge, what provides good security. Well, one is opportunities to escape predators. So this is large lakes with islands is one of the big ones. So you can think of something like Wabakimi and some of the lakes that are there. Those are very typical areas that caribou would focus on in terms of separating themselves from predators and finding secure areas. Good visibility, few barriers to their movement and their selection of habitats. Typically, they live in landscapes that have low densities of predators. So that whole business of reducing predator encounter rates is really important to their survival. And caribou typically live, even in good habitats, at low densities, particularly the boreal caribou. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the migratory caribou or the boreal caribou, whether they've in those huge herds or otherwise, the land that is used by the caribou is typically occupied at levels of 1 to 3 per 100 square kilometers. That would be a normal self-sustaining population of woodland caribou. Put that in perspective of 20 to 25 for moose, or way higher than that for hundreds for white-tailed deer. So in a place like Wabakimi Park, this would suggest that if Wabakimi Park caribou populations were healthy, they'd be somewhere between 90 and 270 caribou living in there. And that we would consider that pretty darn successful. I'm not sure what the actual population estimate is right now, but consider that. The low density is one of the things that typically describes our landscape. But let's look at the other side, things that tend to reduce the refuge value of the landscape. One is anything that contributes to increased predator numbers. So that increases predator encounter rates. Anything that increases the movement of predators. So the two primary predators are wolves all year, bears in the summertime. But the increased movement efficiency of predators and the ability of predators to hunt a landscape is terribly important. It is a terribly major risk factor. And of course, unnecessary caribou movement. If caribou are in a secure place and disturbances occur that force them off and send them somewhere else, you're increasing the chance that they're going to encounter predators elsewhere. Likewise, one of the major predator avoidance strategies by caribou is get up and move. They're incredibly efficient movers across the rugged boreal landscape. When encountered by a pack of wolves, caribou will often just start to walk. So overnight, they might be 40 kilometers away. They might be outside of the range of that wolf pack, out of the territory of the wolf pack. And they might be able to live in a new area for weeks before whatever wolf pack has that in their territory even discovers that they're there. So that's kind of a hidden thing in the caribou story. The idea that just because something isn't occupied now doesn't mean it's not a very important part of a caribou-friendly landscape for this strategy in using space. So I'll just leave that aside. I knew that took a little bit of time, but I'm going to use that to jump off into a slightly different portion of this story. Each one of these could have its own backstory, by the way, right? And so we're sort of skimming across the top of a few different storylines. But the take-home message from that first part is a caribou landscape is large. If you don't get anything else, take-home message number one, a caribou landscape is large. You heard me mention the importance of conifer forests. What is it about conifer forests that contributes to that concept of refuge? Well, and the other part of this is that boreal forests burn. So they're not always there. Just going from upper left down and counterclockwise. So that was a fire on the south shore of Wabakimi Lake in 1996. Anybody who's paddled Wabakimi knows what that looks like. It looked like then, it's looking like now. These are different areas, of course, but the next photo immediately below it, you typically end up with a very diverse landscape with patches that didn't burn, etc. And in those first 15 to 20 years, it's pretty good moose habitat. You know, it tends to support higher levels of moose, predators, etc. The upper right-hand corner, you'll eventually get to the stage around 60 to 80 years of age or so where that pattern typically tends to disappear. You can see the older forest patches and the younger forest patches. And then, of course, down the lower right-hand corner, that's what we refer to as a large tract of conifer boreal forest. Well, what is it about conifer trees? Well, one of the first things to know about conifer trees is they regenerate very well after fire. And of course, jack pine has special adaptations to help it come back after fire. Conifer trees often give way to conifer through succession, and where a jack pine forest might start as almost pure jack pine, the spruce is almost always there, and the spruce will follow. And some of our oldest conifer forests are almost pure spruce. And some of the jack pine is actually dropping out. There's some excellent areas where that would be the case in Wabakimi Park, areas that haven't burned for several hundred years. Even on very shallow soils, the conifer is an important byproduct of fire. And of course, even with shallow soil succession, we end up with the conifers leading on to conifers. And in extreme cases of fire, at extremely high intensity, the fire can get so intense that it can burn off most of the surface nutrients. And virtually all you get is a few stunted trees and lichen growing on bare ground, because virtually all the soil nutrients have been burned off in the extensive fire. This was a photograph from just north of Lac Sewell. There's also some examples of this just northeast of Pickle Lake. But the real secret and the real story for caribou in the conifer forest is conifer needles are acidifying. So some of the most acidifying conifers are jack pine and black spruce. Red pine comes close, but we're not in red pine country when we're talking about caribou. When the needles hit the ground and start decomposing, or even when the throughfall of rainfall is coming through that conifer canopy, it's bringing down cations, and you're changing the chemical composition of the forest floor. It's becoming more acid. You are gradually acidifying the soil, and you're slowing down the rate of nutrient cycling. So much so that you begin to develop that organic mat, even though it's not a peatland, it's still a kind of it has a special term for the organic material on top of the upland forest soils. But in this case, the nutrients either get washed down into the soil profile, or they are captured in the undecomposed organic material on the forest floor. The bottom line is nutrient cycling slows down with age. And with that slowing down of nutrient cycling, basically the primary productivity of that landscape is reducing, and its ability to support other prey species and high level of predators is being reduced. It's a fascinating story in its own right. And of course, at some points, it can get so extreme that you actually get pollution occurring on upland areas, where the upland sites actually get overtaken by sphagnum mosses. And for all intents and purposes, I heard a little an interesting webinar the other day where a fellow was calling peat mosses the assassins of the boreal forest, because eventually they will kill off other species and slow down their growth to their point of non-existence. And of course, he was talking at the point of bog formation, but something less severe actually can occur on upland areas as well. Bottom line is, nutrients are tied up, they're not available. When fire comes, fire frees up those nutrients, and it's a withdrawal from the carbon bank. And these photographs actually came from two different areas off Wabakimi Lake as well, one from the recent Ecology Lake burn on the left, and one from an area towards the east end of Wabakimi Lake on the right-hand side. But you can see the level of, the reason for this is not necessarily to show fire effects, because fire will be something I can talk about at Wabakimi Rendezvous. I want to keep saying Wabakimi Revenue, but no, Wabakimi Rendezvous. The purpose of showing these slides was to show that these are upland soils, and that's how many nutrients were being kept from being recycled on an annual basis. And that low productivity is a cornerstone of a caribou landscape. But of course, once fire occurs, you free up a lot of those nutrients and it becomes the basis for the new conifer forest. Those are jack pine and black spruce seedlings. And of course, you're off and running into a new conifer forest. This is a 24-year-old burn. So this is the South Shore Wabakimi fire area right now, and or a couple of years ago. And you see the lichen is coming back in. The conifer trees are still fairly short, not heavily used by caribou yet because they also like visibility. And so that's another reason that they tend to focus on older conifer forests. And so one of the take-home messages here relates to those older conifer forests. Conifer purity is important. Even a 10% composition of hardwoods in a stand is enough to begin the promotion of more broadleaf herbaceous material and shrubs in the understory. And it's not saying that doesn't occur. It occurs all over caribou range. But the bottom line is the higher the proportion of conifer, typically the better refuge habitat it is. I want to take a jump for a minute just over to the broadleaf environment. It's fundamentally different. And the broadleaf environment is different because the nutrients from the fallen leaves are available for decomposition and reuse every year. So the combination of sunlight penetration and nutrient availability certainly creates a different forest condition. So we've certainly seen these in areas of Wabakimi or in the far north. They become less common as you do go further north. This condition is persistent through succession. High levels of broadleaf shrubs or herbs promotes alternate biomass, which ultimately supports predators. And conversion towards hardwoods on parts of the landscape is very tough, extremely hard to reverse, because both poplar and birch reproduce extremely well after fire. So if you create conditions where you encourage them in one generation, you won't get rid of them in the next generation, not without help. And unfortunately, what we see in many areas of caribou range that caribou used to occupy and no longer do, and probably never will, is the succession to balsam fir, mixed woods. And this is a common outcome in forestry or logging operations with insufficient conifer renewal efforts. We have lots of examples with that. These forests are havens for wolves and bear. They're great for moose and deer, great for snowshoe hare, they're great for ruffed grouse, but typically not for caribou. There's patches of these within caribou range. Patches like this are normal in caribou range, but in extremely small proportions. So the point again, when we start talking about landscapes for caribou, what is dominating the landscape and what is dictating things at the population level? I want to jump down to just leave the conifer forest piece for a little bit. Talk about big lakes with islands. Those of you who've paddled in Wabakimi can then visualize, some of the big lakes there, but you can think about lakes like, Trout Lake or Sessaganiga Lake, or you can think about lakes to the east of Lake Nipigon, or even Lake Nipigon itself. Lakes with big islands are very popular spots for caribou to seek refuge when they're about to have a calf or to find, refuge from predation. And this year, I just pulled this out of some existing slides I had. This is Trout Lake, just outside of Red Lake. An arrow pointing to one of several calving lakes on that lake. It's not unlike, well, it's very common for caribou to have areas that they go back to year after year. There's some debate in the literature about fidelity and how, whether they go back to the same island but going back to the same general area, the same general lake basin is a very common thing. Once that's disturbed, it's tough to get reestablished again. Now, caribou from a lake, and that we learned from our collaring exercise, normal distances can range anywhere from 40 to 60 kilometers between where they might have their calves and where they might go to find their resources in the wintertime. So you think about that as a radius of, let's just use 50 kilometers as the radius from here. You'd be talking about a circle with a 100-kilometer radius or a 100-kilometer diameter around a calving lake, all of which might be important to providing that continuous supply of resources for caribou. That too is supposed to help you visualize what scale of consideration somebody should have when they think about what is supporting caribou, whether those are caribou on Caribou Lake, caribou on Wabakimi Lake. You put that radius in there and you could be almost going out the park on either side, right? So the park is not very big from a caribou conservation perspective. And I'll come back to that one a little bit more in a bit. But caribou are excellent swimmers. When disturbed on an island, they can easily outswim any of the predators. Islands tend not to get hunted heavily by wolves or bears, even though they can both swim. This is just a little story about, first of all, the upper two left photographs is just my grandson on Elf Lake last summer. He and I went on a trip and we were through Elf Lake. He's just pointing to a Caribou Cow Antler. Cows shed their antlers right around calving time. They often keep them through the winter, as opposed to the bulls, which lose them early winter. But this is a site that was, I strongly believe this was a site that was used as a calving site on a small island on Elf Lake. And that would have been in the winter, in the summertime, and it would have been that spring. Another island on the same lake had a potential kill site, but probably from the winter. The color of the wolf pellets, the scraps of hide were definitely winter coat. And in the wintertime, the benefit of the lakes completely disappears. So there's no advantage to focusing on lakes in the wintertime. They'll be back finding other areas where they can escape predators and have refuge. So this idea of lakes as a habitat, water is important, big lakes with islands is important, but the whole landscape within that lake, within which that lake exists, is important as well. Because when the ice forms, there's no further refuge value to those islands, right? So that's another part of the story to take into account. Peatlands behave the same way as lakes do. They don't get hunted heavily, and they're excellent refuge habitat. Take-home message number 3, large water bodies with islands or peatlands are important for calving success and survival. You see a large lake with islands in Caribou Range, there's a good chance you'll find some evidence of at least attempted calving activity on those areas. So let's move on to another special relationship with the land. That's the relationship caribou have with Lycan. So there was some interesting work done in several jurisdictions across Canada which have been demonstrating the point that habitat selection by caribou is hierarchical. I've mentioned this a couple of times so far in the talk. I'll probably keep mentioning it. First, security. There is a need for security. There seem to be some innate selection behaviors which allow them and tend to focus them on secure habitats. Within those, if you really want to find the caribou, find the lichen patches, right? They will concentrate on that forage activity if they can avoid being eaten. And if you can find both in the same place, you get bonus points. So places like Wabakimi are fabulous in that regard. They've got the shallow soils, they've got peatlands, you've got areas with great potential to produce lichen, but at the same time, you've also got great expanses of relatively undisturbed boreal forest, even though you have a fire cycle. Those terrestrial lichens that you see on the forest floor and are so important, they're used all year round, almost exclusively in the wintertime. But some recent studies have actually shown they use it much more in the summertime than we ever thought they did in the past. Those are studies that took place in the last decade. There's a reason these lichens are often called caribou moss. But in fact, Cladina rangiferina, you translate that, you can say that's reindeer lichen or caribou lichen. Food doesn't really appear to be limiting to caribou in areas where caribou live. But the most interesting thing about lichen ecology, and you can have a whole sequel of the talk just on fascinating aspects of lichen ecology. But the Coles Notes version is lichen will grow where it has a substrate to anchor to, where it has light exposure and enough humidity that it can absorb it from the air. They don't have roots. So if it's got a substrate it can anchor to, it's got enough humidity, and it's got light, it can thrive. Lichens are really complex species. They're combinations of algae and a fungus. The algae provides photosynthesis. The fungus provides the structure. They live together in a mutualistic relationship. And they're fabulous caribou food. And whether it's a cut stump, like in this example, what does the cut stump provide? It provides a substrate. It holds it up above the forest floor, gives it light, and it's in an environment that has enough humidity to grow. One of the competing factors here is if the forest is too dense, you tend to promote a lot of feather moss growth, particularly when the forest gets very old. And as you can see in that one photograph in the upper left-hand corner, the lichen has spent an awful lot of time trying to work its way. It's going at about the same speed as the feather moss is. And you can trace the lichen way down towards the bottom of that profile. But it's not doing particularly well, but it can persist on the landscape there too. Just to explore this special relationship just a little bit more. This was something I did for an Ontario nature presentation at one point, talking about the special relationship between lichen and caribou. And it was almost as if the two have something in common. It's almost as if the two have something in common with regards to existence by default. So caribou are the oldest members of the deer family. And lichen, you can trace lichen way, way back, right? Both were the earliest inhabitants of the landscape following the retreat of the ice sheet, following glaciation. Caribou tend to favor low diversity and low productivity landscapes. That's their adaptive strategy. Lichen live in low diversity and low productivity sites. Caribou have very low recruitment levels. Lichen have very slow growth rates. Caribou are extremely susceptible to increased predation. and lichen are very susceptible to shade. Anything that adds nutrients into the environment that promotes shade-producing species will eliminate the lichen. And caribou live in almost any areas where predators are not abundant, and lichen lives in almost any areas where other plants do not thrive. Caribou and lichen are almost as if they were made for each other. And that is an interesting story in its own right. So these low productivity landscapes, this is our prime caribou habitat around Elf Lake on the shallow soils. Some of these forests are several hundred years old. The trees aren't, but it's been that long since some of these areas burned. The bedrock outcroppings are maintaining a very good lichen cover. And of course, this is very heavily used in the wintertime by caribou. I'm just going to skip over a couple slides here. I see I'm going a little bit over what I was anticipating in time. I'm only going to mention this on the one side. I don't want to harp on it. But all these questions we've raised with regards to conifer forest, with regards to productivity of the landscape, almost everything we do on the landscape with human alteration, such as through logging or forestry or whatever, tends to increase the flow of nutrients and often increases the diversity of the landscape, and is often detrimental to caribou. But it doesn't have to be. But the slide on the right-hand side here, which I thought was always particularly interesting, and I've used this one for several years. This was a previously forested site with the jack pine lichen forest plant community, where the trees were removed and some site preparation went through mixing the mineral soil. And the lichen and mosses maintained themselves quite consistently. But all the areas where the soil was mixed up and stirred up, and of course it's not always just through forestry equipment. This could be roadside stuff. This could be other alterations that humans create on the landscape. You tend to promote a lot of seedbed opportunity for the growth of other shrubs and trees. There's the last thing I'm going to mention. There's two little slides here. I'm not going to go through all this, so don't panic. I just wanted to hit the left-hand side on this slide and then just go down to a very small portion of this one. Caribou populations decline if we have increased mortality or reduced recruitment. That ultimately means if we increase calf mortality, we have reduced recruitment. If we increase adult mortality, we have less breeding adults. There's many things that can affect this equation. One of the primary is increased encounter rates by predators, leading to increased predation. I'm going to get rid of everything else on the slide and just talk about a couple of things here for a minute. The two major predators are bears and wolves. Bears in the summer, wolves all year. We're concerned about where predators are located, things that could increase predator populations, and things that could alter predator efficiency. It is through this last little piece, I'm just going to highlight a couple of points with the intent of reinforcing why land stewardship is important. With regards to location of predators, one of the primary human factors is food subsidies. Food subsidies expressed in things as simple as a dump, which in some recent studies has shown that dumps are a major factor concentrating and influencing the distribution of wolves in parts of Northwestern Ontario. Even some of our remote tourism sites have their own separate little dumps. Things as innocuous as shore launch sites on lakes with big islands, if those sites are also used by caribou for calving, and if the sites are not maintained in an appropriate way to eliminate the fish smell that could attract bears out to the calving islands, because they will pursue those smells. With respect to things like forest management, there's a major influence on forest cover, patch size, stand composition, particularly in not renewing the conifer composition that was there, that can lead to a change in alternate prey levels. And down below, and they all lead to an increase in food biomass on the landscape, leading to increase in predator numbers. That's been well documented in many jurisdictions across North America. And finally, this question of predatory efficiency. Some recent studies have shown very effectively that eroded landscape, even roads that we've called decommissioned, greatly increase the movement rates and movement distances of wolves across the landscape. And they don't have to stumble on a caribou. They just have to be able to move efficiently across the landscape to encounter evidence of the caribou, and then they can go into pursuit mode. So all three of those factors, all of those factors come into play. And they're all factors that humans have control over. So when you come back to things like that concept of refuge and talk about increased predator numbers, reducing or increasing risk, increased predator movement, increased efficiency of predator movement, or even restricting caribou options on the landscape of where they can go if they were trying to escape predators and reestablish themselves. Every aspect of refuge can be directed by land management decisions. If it goes in the wrong direction, it was the result of choice. And that's the last message I wanted to leave with you. And with that, and I'm sorry I went a little bit over on the time there, Vern.
Oh, no.
I'm prepared to answer any questions or.
I have at least one question in the chat box. I encourage people to add more. One of the questions was, do burn areas result in new plant growth used right away by caribou? So I'm assuming that means if there's a fire, will that provide habitat and food immediately after the fire or not?
No, typically not. Lycan is typically destroyed. Caribou will eat herbaceous material. But the biggest risk from the fire perspective is the biomass, the primary productivity that can emerge on a site can encourage higher populations of moose response. Remember, even in a perfect caribou landscape, there's probably still more moose than there are caribou. Right, that's a really important message. A lot of people don't realize that, but there's probably still more moose on a landscape, even in a good caribou landscape. But moose, because they're more fecund, can respond fairly quickly and produce nodes within that landscape that also become predator traps, like places that will encourage higher levels of predation associated with those local higher densities. Same thing can happen with regards to cutovers. So although there is a slight benefit to caribou in terms of their availability of nitrogen producing forage, which small herbaceous material does get consumed by caribou, you tend to lose in terms of refuge value and their benefit in terms of escaping predation.
So do the caribou, are the woodland caribou solitary then, or do they form groups?
In the summer, they're mostly solitary.
Oh, okay.
In the winter, they will form small groups. So a common group size would be anywhere from maybe 4 to 10, maybe up to 15 and at times. But when you're encountering them in the summertime, paddling in a place like Wabakimi, you might see there might only be 3 or 4 caribou using one of those big lakes, 5 or 6 just using one of those big lakes, but they'll be solitary. They won't be hanging out together.
Oh.
You'll have cows with calves that are hanging out together, but the bulls will be off somewhere. The cows will be off somewhere with their calves. That's that kind of isolation strategy.
Gerry, a question about herbicide use after logging. And I think that's in regards to the broadleaf. The second part of the quote was it's been banned in Quebec for 20 some years. So talk about herbicide use as far as logging management or forest management after it's been logged.
I tried to do this whole talk without talking about herbicides. and I tried to do it all without mentioning policy. And I tried to mention all without mentioning guidelines or et cetera. Or for that matter, listing as a species at risk. I tried to get through the whole presentation without saying any of that stuff. I'd rather say, for the sake of this conversation, because that is one of the sequel stories, right? There's a whole other story around the silviculture and renewal. But the bottom line is the conifer forest landscape is essential to the well-being of caribou. If you cannot replace it, over the long term, caribou will lose. And we know that conifer is the species that is being pursued, particularly at the northern extent of forestry operations, particularly open-growing upland conifer. And those are the sites that are most easily converted. It's expensive wood, and there's a real silviculture and renewal challenge. And although fire can do a fabulous job of bringing that conifer back, the harvest and planting and artificial regeneration is a much more challenging process to bring back that same level of conifer purity.
Okay. Another question about ticks. The march north of ticks, is that a threat to caribou?
You're talking winter ticks?
Well, I'm assuming so.
We really don't have much experience with that. I'm assuming it would be a threat to caribou, just like it is a danger to moose. And of course, being in a more severe taxing climate and with a species with a very specially adapted coat with the hollow hairs and the just kind of a legendary insulating layer, loss of fur due to tick infestation, I can imagine would be quite traumatic. But really, we don't really have an overlap. So I don't think there's an awful lot of evidence as to whether or not that's true, unless it's from game farms that might have caribou, further south where it might be a problem.
Brainworm, can deer transmit brainworm to caribou? We This is one of the biggest threats from a climate change perspective, is with the northward march of white-tailed deer. We all know that caribou or that moose will die from a brainworm infestation and that deer can carry it. And the overlap with deer and moose is a major factor affecting moose populations in Northwestern Ontario. There is a fair bit of evidence to suggest that caribou are much more susceptible to brainworm infestation than moose are, and that where moose might live at least through one breeding cycle while being infected before they eventually die, caribou have been known to die within weeks of an infection. So it is a concern, and so the overlap of deer and caribou is a major concern. How do managers monitor woodland caribou populations? Some of the maps we have seen show historical data, but is there much recent research on their population centers and where they're actually existing?
Typically, it goes in fits and starts. There was a very major focus on caribou inventory and assessment dating back into the, is my screen still showing?
Oh, yeah, yes.
Yeah, okay, hold on. Province-wide, this is just a picture of some historical observations, right, from caribou. Some of those are, now these ones can go back too far. Actually, I want to go back to this other one here. This is actually focusing on the Wabakimi Park area. So there's Lake Nipigon over here on the right-hand side. This is, what do we got? We got Silver Dollar, here's Savant Lake. You can see various observations of caribou. Now, these have come in fits and starts. There was a major focus on caribou inventory work in the 50s. There was another in the 70s at the time that they were doing the West Patricia Land Use Plan, and there was the Royal Commission on the Northern Environment. There had always been independent academic studies that had been taking place. Harold Cumming had done a lot of work in and around Lake Nipigon. There had been a number of aerial surveys done of Wabakimi Park. It had been known for a long time, ever since the park was created, just how many, with the densities of caribou that were existing in there. So those were more focused type of research activities. The last big provincial effort was one that I was involved with between 2008 and 2014. So there was an awful lot of effort that took place there, and we covered most of Northern Ontario in assessments. Shortly after that, things really dropped off, and there has not been a lot of recent assessment effort in the last decade, but my understanding is that there's going to be some kicking off again. So it's going to be really interesting to see, because what is evident from the data is that every time we come back a couple decades later, we've lost caribou from the southern end of its range. And I fear we're about to do that again. And but just tying in with my other story here, the areas that seem to be most resistant to range recession seem to be areas that are anchored with blocks of land that have a large number of large water bodies with islands. It's really quite remarkable, the power of those calving areas. But once they're lost, we have very little evidence to suggest that caribou start coming back to lakes that have not been used for calving for a decade or more. Once it's gone, it's likely gone. Right now, I fear that we're very, very close. We're not that far away from separating and isolating the caribou that typically use Lake Nipigon from its range to the north and areas that it relies upon for winter habitats. And I think that should be a very major conservation concern.
Wow. I'm just going to keep throwing questions at you. Can bears outrun a calf? Is that why bears are predators in the summer?
I beg your pardon, I missed.
I'm sorry. The question was, can bears outrun a calf? Is that why bears are predators in the summer?
Well, first of all, bears are predators in the summer because they're asleep all winter. But bears are efficient predators of moose calves, deer fawns, and caribou calves. Anything that creates an opportunity for bears to be put in closer proximity to areas where caribou would be to raise their calves puts caribou calves at risk. Just a couple of things here. I mentioned the shore lunch site concerns. I mentioned the dump. It's easy to see how dumps and human garbage in general, the clean campsite idea is a very meritorious in caribou range, right? But a lot of people lose track of the effect of roadsides, even decommissioned roadsides. Roadsides have been demonstrated in several studies with early green up. And one of the major food sources, desires for moose or for bears in the springtime is for early nitrogen. They get nitrogen from being predatory and eating meat, and they get nitrogen from green vegetation at roadside. And the first place to green up often is roadsides, particularly if it has dandelions. Dandelions and clover and other things that grow frequently along roadsides. And of course, we know that bears travel on roads routinely as well. Roads anywhere in the vicinity of calving lakes probably increases the chance of bear predation on caribou calves.
Okay, Maurice.
That's whether they're used or not.
Okay, I'm just going to keep going here. Maurice, you asked a question, or you typed a question, but I'm going to ask you just to ask it. Unmute yourself, just to make sure you ask it correctly. I'm not sure I've got the gist of your question. So Maurice, if you would go ahead and just unmute and ask your question.
Was that about? It's Fiona here.
Okay, Fiona, go ahead.
Lycan University had some involvement in studies. I guess I was aware of some folks in my social network that were studying and I got the impression that there was disagreements between the academics about some of the issues respecting conservation of caribou. What kind of themes do caribou biologists argue about?
Oh, hey, that's a really interesting question. Well, I've had the opportunity to witness this right across North America in terms of different forums. Now, first of all, I want to separate two aspects of that question. One aspect is the fundamental building blocks of the science of caribou ecology. And there's not as much debate as one might perceive in viewing some of the discussions that take place. There is a debate, and a legitimate debate, about the relative weighting of predation and forage availability. Now, certainly in Arctic herds, early green up of vegetation is really key to the survival of the young. There is a persistent aspect of debate that forage may be more important than predation in some landscapes, forage availability, and that nutrient status of the cows and their calves may be an important part of calf survival rates, right? So there is that important piece. I believe the majority of the scientific community will still put the weight on predation first. And if you can avoid getting eaten, you'll focus on forage availability, right? So I think that's fairly straightforward. When you deal with the other aspect, which is how do you manage a landscape to maintain caribou? There's lots of debate because there's so many different strategies, and it's very difficult to get a good controlled experiment to evaluate all the management strategies at the scale that you would have to do for caribou. In Ontario, I think maybe one of the research studies you had been referring to was was a major research study that had 3 major study areas, one up around Pickle Lake, one just to the northeast of Lake Nipigon, and one over in the James Bay lowlands, or at the edge of the James Bay lowlands, off in the Cochrane area. And of course, they were looking at it as a control around Pickle Lake. They were looking at it as a treatment area, a heavily harvested area over towards Lake Nipigon, et cetera. It was through that experiment they started coming up with some very interesting data that was verifying many of our assumptions we had before, right? That wolves were a major predator on both moose and caribou. There was no doubt that the more heavily diverse habitats that had been previously logged supported higher densities of wolves, and the packs were more closely packed together. There was lots of evidence that wolves increased their movement efficiency in a roaded landscape as opposed to an unroaded landscape. So a lot of that is borne out. There's still a lot of debate about how much of an advantage roads are. There's still a lot of debate about the role of linear features. There is a big debate about the scientific evaluation of critical habitat, the one that was done at the national level, and how they tried to deal with cumulative effects and the relative weighting of different effects in their model. So yeah, there's lots that is debated, but the fundamentals of caribou ecology seem to be largely not in dispute.
I'm going to throw one last question at you, Mr. Racey, and then we'll let you go. What is the calving window, and what would be the best? And so therefore, is it best to avoid camping on islands during the calving window?
I would say no. I would say awareness is more important than avoidance. And here's the reason. There is the calving window where the calves are actually born. If they're actually born on the island, they might stay in around the islands, they might move inland just a little bit, or they might, but they may also have had their calf. There's also lots of examples where the calf is born offshore, in the mainland area, in a small peatland or something like that. And after the calf is born, they take their calf to the lake and they go out to the islands. But if they're not disturbed, they might spend the whole summer on those islands, okay, and leave in the fall. During the rut, they all start moving around in September during the rut. Probably more important is to recognize that if you go onto your campsite and you find caribou pellets all over the place, or you find some of the really small soft pellets that could indicate that there's a calf on the island, just stay low, stay local. You could go over to another spot, but don't be traipsing all over the island because they might just be down at the other end. There's no sense chasing them off the island, right?
In Wabakimi proper, is it early May then, or late April?
It would be early May, yeah.
Early May. Oh.
Early May. Well, this is the interesting thing about this whole shore lunch discussion, is that calving season and the first couple of weeks of the calf's life overlap with walleye opening season. It's when you all of a sudden go from virtually no activity on the lake to often being swarmed with boats, and shore lunch locations and and things like that. The remote tourism is not benign, but is not entirely benign, but many of the actions remote tourist operators can take in educating their clientele could go a long way to minimizing impacts.
So that implies that remote outposts and planes do have an impact landing and traipsing around those big lakes?
Well, there's also a fair bit of evidence to say that caribou that have become acclimatized to it don't get disturbed by it too much, right? So that's one of the reasons I would say no. Trying to do a prohibition to say no, don't camp on islands at that time of the year, because you're out there, you're often camping on islands for the same reason the caribou are on the islands, is you're less likely to encounter a bear.
Well, Mr. Racey, you are an absolute fountain of knowledge. You are an absolute pleasure to listen to. Very much appreciate you being here, and you've also been very generous in plugging the Wabakimi Rendezvous, which will be September 8th through the 11th next fall in the Thunder Bay Armstrong area. There'll be more information on that coming out from the Friends of Wabakimi. But again, we all thank you very much for being a partner in this webinar and sharing your vast knowledge of caribou. And I'm sure we could probably go on for 2 or 3 hours and we'd still have questions for you, but I'm going to let you have the rest of the night off, but go ahead.
Well, there's just one thing I want to say before I part. Okay. I talked about prequels and I talked about sequels. Now, some of the questions that I'll always get raised if I focus on caribou at this level are some of the backstory items. The major backstory themes tend to be Lycan ecology and evolution, caribou physiology. You asked that question before you even get started, the special adaptations they have. Range recession, what brought them to this point? Like what's defined that lower boundary right now? The influence of landscape geology is a really important backstory to this whole distribution of the forests and the peatlands and things. And of course, the fire ecology. I'll be talking about the fire ecology and linking it a little bit to caribou at the Wabakimi Rendezvous. But the 3 big sequels that once you have this discussion we had tonight and that you could be thinking about when you are exposed to other storylines. Climate change. How does this story change, when you start adding the shift in climate? It's a fascinating story in its own right. Forest management impacts, right? All those other things that are happening out there on the landscape, and cumulative effects. This whole thing that they've tried to deal with at the national level on understanding how everything from forestry to mining to climate change to road maintenance, fits into the caribou conservation story. Those are the sequels. So you can just ponder those in your spare time.
Well, that sounds like you want to do you're willing to do another webinar next winter on one of those topics.
Let's get the rendezvous out of the way first.
Okay, I'll keep bugging you. Thanks you very much.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the good questions, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gerry. Outstanding.
Thank you very much.